In the year 1517, an observer of power wrote, "Since it is my intention to write of something of use, I deem it best to stick to practical truth of things rather than to fancies. Many men have imagined republics and principalities that never existed at all. Yet the way men live is far removed from the way they ought to live, that anyone who abandons what is for what should be pursues his downfall rather than his preservation." Well, Niccolo Machiavelli wrote in The Prince an extensive observation of power. Here at BYU today, we're very pleased to welcome a preeminent scholar of power, Professor Joseph Nye. As I mentioned, he is the University Distinguished Service Professor, former Dean of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. In 2008, a poll of international relations scholars ranked Professor Nye as the most influential scholar in the field on American foreign policy. And in 2011, Foreign Policy magazine named him one of the top 100 global thinkers. He has extensive government service, including serving as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, during which he was awarded 2 Distinguished Service Medals, as Deputy to the Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, Science, and Technology, as Chair of the National Security Council Group on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and as Chair of the National Intelligence Council. Originally joining the Harvard faculty in 1964, he served as Director of the Center for International Affairs, or Harvard's Kennedy Center, as it were. His most recent books are the soon-to-be-released Presidential Leadership and the Creation of the American Era in 2013, The Future of Power, The Powers to Lead, for which he offered an undergraduate seminar earlier today, Soft Power, The Means to Success in World Politics, and The Power Game, a Washington novel. He is a member of the American Academy of Diplomacy, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, an honorary member of the British Academy, and North American chairman of the Trilateral Commission. Professor Nye received a BA summa cum laude from Princeton University, did postgraduate work as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and received a PhD in political science from Harvard University. Tonight, we invite you to join us as he explores his ideas about the future of American power. Ladies and gentlemen, Joseph Nye.
Thank you very much, Corey, and it's a pleasure to be back at Brigham Young University. I had a very nice visit here about 4 or 5 years ago, and let's say the thing that it's not just your mountains and the scenery and so forth. What I really enjoyed today, but not just colleagues, but the students I've met. It's really very pleasant to see so many people with open and inquiring minds. Let me say that tonight, what I'd like to do is think about what's the condition of American power, where have we been in the last century, and where are we going this century. It's an issue that's preoccupied me for, I don't know, the last 20 years or so. I don't know how many of you remember that back in the Reagan period, in the 80s, there was a widespread view that the United States was in decline. And the book that was a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list at the time was a book by my friend Paul Kennedy, a very distinguished Yale historian, originally British, who said that the United States was finished. That basically we were going the way of Edwardian Britain or Philip II Spain. It was all over, and his Rise and Fall of the Great Powers became a bestseller. I wrote a book at the time because I thought he was wrong, and I did not think the United States was in decline. I wrote a book called Bound to Lead, and I'm pleased to say that I think I got the answer right, but he got all the royalties. And there is a tendency in the United States, which is a long-standing tendency, to worry about our decline and to think we're in decline. And we sort of, as a people, we go through cycles of hubris and declinism. And so that if you think back to the 1960s, in the Cold War, there was a belief that the Soviet Union was overtaking us. In the 1980s, the Japanese were overtaking us. And today, people think the Chinese are overtaking us. And what's interesting is that, the Soviets weren't 10 feet tall, and the Japanese weren't 10 feet tall, and the Chinese aren't 10 feet tall. And I think the moral of the story is Americans have got to learn to have a little bit clearer view of what the world is like so that we have a better understanding of American power and our position in the world. And we've not always been as good at that understanding as we need to be. If you look at the situation of the United States, it is quite remarkable that by the end of the 20th century, the United States was the preeminent power in the world. We had about half of the world's military budget, so nobody could form a balance of power against us. We had the world's largest economy, still do, and we had more soft power in the sense of the cultural resources in our universities and our entertainment industry that attract others. And in that sense, it was quite remarkable that you didn't have a global balance of power. You had American primacy. And that's sometimes been called the American era. And I've been interested in trying to explore where did that come from and where is it going? Well, how did the Americans get to be the prime power in the world? And what's going to happen in the future? And this is a question which has been on my mind, as I said, for a couple of decades since I wrote that book, Answering Paul Kennedy. And what I'd like to do tonight is talk a little bit about the next book that I'm doing, or the one that's coming out in May, on presidential leadership and the creation of the American era, because it may help us to answer the question of, does it matter what our leaders do or say? Or putting it another way around is, do leaders matter? If you look at the 2012 campaign, both Governor Romney and President Obama promised that they would resist decline and that they would maintain American primacy. But one of the questions we ought to ask, is it in their power to do anything about it? Does it matter who's president? Or thinking about it another way, is it all in the cards that are dealt, not in the leaders that we have? In other words, if you have a continent the size of ours, and you have two oceans, and an economy that grows as well as ours, were you just bound to become the primary leading country of the 20th century anyway? And there are two sets of, as academics look at this, there are two sets of theories that go into this. The international relations people tend to say, yes, it's in the structure of the situation, that the human leadership is secondary or not all that important. And the people who study leadership say, no, it's leaders who matter, and it makes all the difference what kind of leaders you have. So I've been puzzling in this new book of how would you sort that out. I'm interested that Henry Kissinger is alleged to have said when he was teaching at Harvard, where I studied under him, that when he was at Harvard, he thought it was all structural. It was all just the way the cards were dealt by geography and history and so forth. But after he got to the White House, he decided leadership mattered. So I guess where you stand on this issue depends on where you sit. But I've tried to sort this out in a different way. I've tried to say, well, what would happen if you looked at this president by president over the course of the 20th century, and you imagined that you had a different leader, a different president, than the one who was elected? Imagine that the next most likely person had been president. Would it all have turned out the same or not? So if you think back historically, if William McKinley hadn't been assassinated, there would never have been a Teddy Roosevelt. If Teddy Roosevelt hadn't run as a third-party candidate in 1912, there would have never been a Woodrow Wilson. And you can go on and on like that through the century. And that's basically raises this question, this sort of counterfactual history of did the leaders matter or not? Now, when you look at leaders, there's a strong tendency to look at leaders in terms of whether they are transformational or transactional. And ever since James McGregor Burns wrote his book on leadership in 1978, the general preference has been for what's called transformational leaders, leaders who really shake things up, who make a big change. And transactional leaders or managerial leaders are discounted. And so in addition to the question of, do leaders matter, I'm interested in the question of, does it matter what kind of leaders you have in terms of whether America would have become the power that it eventually become? Well, I think the general argument for why leaders probably play a role is and that it's not purely structural forces, is partly answered by the fact that the growth of American power in the 20th century wasn't smooth. In other words, if you just traced the growth of the American economy, if you looked at our structural strength, then American power should have risen proportionately. We should have just kept getting stronger and stronger and been more and more influential in the world. But what's interesting is that's not the way the history of the century turned out. After the period 1900 to 1920, we had the next 20 years a period where we were less influential, where we turned inward and didn't play much of a role. Yet our economy continued to grow. Our share of the world economy continued to grow, yet our influence in the world diminished. So if it were just structural, then you'd say there's something wrong, these charts don't fit together as well as they should. And if you look over the century, the United States was about a quarter of the world's economy at the start of the 20th century, and about 22%, or almost a quarter of the world's economy at the end of the 20th century, rising up to about 45% during World War II, when everybody else was prostrate because of the effects of the war, which made us artificially larger than others. But by and large, we didn't suffer any decline in our strength from the beginning to the end of the century. But we did have this odd pattern, so that if you look at the periods which led to American power becoming preeminent, you'd say that you have 1900 to 1920, and then 20 to 1940 is sort of inward period, and then 47 to 70, a period in which we're turning outward again. But basically, with Vietnam and the aftermath of the Vietnam War, up until 1980, our power, I would argue, diminishes. In the 80s, it begins to increase again until, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, American primacy is clear. So those are the periods in which you can divide the growth of American power, which you can see American power, which is 1900 to 1920, 1941 basically till about 1970, and then 1980 till the end of the century. So let's look at the presidents who were in charge in those key periods, and let's see whether they mattered, playing this little counterfactual game that I suggested. Well, 1900 to 1920, the two key presidents were Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were both transformational leaders in the sense that they wanted to make big changes. They didn't want the status quo. They were going to change the world. They both were quite charismatic in their style. They both had similarities. They were both Ivy League presidents. They both were writers, both wrote a number of books. They both won Nobel Prizes for their work while they were in office in foreign affairs. But they were very different otherwise, and indeed had quite opposite views of the world. Teddy Roosevelt, who starts the century, built the American Navy, took the Panama Canal, which meant we could move the Navy back and forth from the Atlantic to the Pacific without having to go around the Cape. He mediated in the Russo-Japanese War. That's what he got his Nobel Prize for. He also mediated in the conflict between Germany and France and Morocco. And if you think about it, these were really quite different positions than were traditional American positions. American traditional positions in foreign policy really were the Monroe Doctrine, telling the Europeans to stay out of our hemisphere. But this idea of meddling in Asia or in Europe, that ran against George Washington's advice and John Quincy Adams' advice, which is to mind our own hemisphere. So in that sense, Teddy Roosevelt made a difference. But what's interesting, and this is a point that Henry Kissinger makes in his book on diplomacy, comparing Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, Roosevelt didn't leave much of a legacy because he didn't educate the American people. His intervention in the global balance of power, for example, in Morocco, was something he kept pretty much to himself. He didn't explain it much to the people or the Congress. It ran against the tradition, and he didn't want to get in trouble for doing this. And so while Roosevelt did some interesting and important things, some of this might have happened anywhere. There would have been a Panama Canal within another 10 years or so. In fact, it might have been a Nicaragua Canal rather than the Panama Canal. But something would have happened. The Navy would have been built. The canal would have been built. You might not have had the meddling in Europe and Asia, but that part didn't really last anyway. So I think Teddy Roosevelt, much as though he's a personal hero of mine, particularly for what he did on the domestic front, I don't think that he had a lasting effect as great as people think, and that structural forces probably would have produced the same outcome within another decade or so anyway. Now you go to Woodrow Wilson, who, as I mentioned, ironically, would not have been president if Teddy Roosevelt hadn't tried to become president again, running as a bull moose candidate in 1912. Taft would have been reelected, and Wilson would never have made it. Wilson was interesting in the sense that he came into office not wanting to be bothered with foreign affairs. And the last thing he wanted was to get involved in World War I. And getting involved in World War I really was against American tradition. The idea that you would send 2 million American troops into a battle in Europe was just against everything that George Washington and his successors had told us was the right way to run a foreign policy. And yet Wilson did it. And when he did it, Teddy Roosevelt had been urging him to do it well before that. But when he did it, Wilson did something very different from Roosevelt would have done. He wrapped it up in American moralism. He had his 14 points in which he was going to change the world. He was going to abolish the balance of power, which he regarded as a corrupt way of doing international politics. Said it's where the great countries, the big powers, treat the little powers like cheeses to be cut up for the sake of the big powers. And so he promised that we were going to get rid of all the iniquitous ways of the European balance of power, and we were going to replace it by a League of Nations in which you didn't balance power by forming alliances with others. You had a system where you had all the good guys against the bad guy. Everybody teamed up against the aggressor. And that theory of collective security, which was embodied in the League of Nations, was Wilson's effort to transform the world, to change the way politics had been done. And the interesting thing about this was it was initially popular with the American people, and when Wilson made this huge transformation of sending a massive American army to Europe, which is very different from anything we'd done before, he did it by appealing to the moral streak of Americans. We're going to change the world. The trouble is, when he got back home, he wasn't able to sell it. And as he ran into resistance in the Senate with Henry Cabot Lodge and others, he decided he would talk directly to the American people. He had his famous tour of the western states, and during his tour of the western states, he had a stroke. And that stroke debilitated him. Ironically, and this is one of the true ironies of history, if the stroke had killed him, the United States probably would have joined the League of Nations, because there was a moderate group of Republicans who would have joined with a moderate group of Democrats to ratify the treaty. But Wilson, in his debilitated commission, forbade the moderate Democrats to accept any reservations to the treaty. The treaty went down in flames, and it led to a rejection by the American people of the whole Wilsonian experience. So by the time you got to the 1930s, rather than American strength growing smoothly through this period, you had an intense isolationism, saying what Wilson had done to get involved in Europe was wrong, and his dreams about a League of Nations were wrong, and essentially we had a diminution of American influence in the world. So there's an irony there of this first phase. The next phase, in which the United States power grows, the creation of the American era, was Franklin Roosevelt and his entry into World War II, where you sent even more American troops to fight, not just in a European, but also in a Pacific war. And Franklin Roosevelt, when he first came into power, was not very interested in foreign affairs. Understandably, we had a Great Depression here at home. And it wasn't until 1938 that Roosevelt decided that Hitler was a threat to us. And after the Munich Pact and the Kristallnacht attack on Jewish stores in Germany, Roosevelt said, at some point, history is going to show us to have made a mistake if we don't resist Hitler. But the American people weren't there. Every time Roosevelt would hint at trying to move public opinion, he would have to snap back because the isolationist strand was so strong. So Roosevelt once said to one of his assistants, he said, "What do you do if you're a leader and you look over your shoulder and nobody's following?" And so he basically tried to manufacture some incidents that would make the American people realize the danger they were in. But it didn't work. For example, there's a case of a U.S. destroyer, the USS Greer, where Franklin Roosevelt told the American people that a German U-boat had attacked the Greer. In fact, as historians now know, the Greer had attacked the German U-boat. But even that didn't turn American opinion. What turned American opinion was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, some historians say that was manufactured too, but actually, as they looked more carefully on it, it wasn't. It was wasn't something that Roosevelt deliberately engineered. But the interesting point is that was what brought the Americans into World War II, which was a huge turning point in terms of the creation of the American era. And one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, what would have happened if we hadn't gone in? So to play this counterfactual game I was talking about, you have to imagine, suppose that you'd had a staunch isolationist president in power in 1941 when the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor. Is it possible that we would not have entered the European War? The answer to that is maybe. For example, the novelist Philip Roth has written a book in which he imagines that the Republicans, instead of nominating Wendell Willkie, who was an internationalist in 1940, had nominated Charles Lindbergh, the great air hero. And Lindbergh was a very staunch isolationist. And Lindbergh might have said, we're not going to get involved in the European war. It's not our business. If that had happened, you would have really had a very different world, a world in which the United States not being involved in Europe might not have countered Hitler's power. The likely result of that would have been Stalin and Hitler, the Soviet Union and the United States and Germany fighting each other to a standstill, and what you might call a tripolar world, where you'd have the Western Hemisphere, Germany in control of the center of Europe, and the Soviets in place, and perhaps the Japanese Empire still in place in the Pacific. But it would have been very different from what we got. What we got was dominance, in which the United States and its allies won World War II. And then the next key point was the decision by Harry Truman to stay there, because it wasn't obvious that we had to stay there. There was a strong strand of opinion that says, win the war, you come home, as we did in World War I. But Truman, who again might not have been president if Roosevelt had kept Henry Wallace as his vice president in 1944, not switched over, Truman again made a crucial decision, which is that not only had the United States intervened, it was going to stay overseas. And by 1947, when he decides on the Marshall Plan, in 1949, when he decides to create NATO, you had something which was very, very different, a permanent American presence abroad. Remember George Washington's key advice, no entangling alliances? And here was the United States with a very entangling alliance, but one which gave us enormous influence and power in the world. And that, again, might not have been the case if you hadn't had Truman as president. If Wallace had been president, it's not clear that you would have had that. But even that might not have made the difference, because there was still a strong strand of American opinion that wanted to come back home, that didn't want to stay overseas. And in 1952, Dwight Eisenhower basically took this strategy of containment of an American presence overseas and made it the basic American policy. And the fact that Eisenhower, as a Republican, was consolidating the policy that Truman had started meant that it became the consensus for the next half century. And that didn't have to happen if Robert Taft had become the Republican nominee in 1952, and if the Republicans had turned out the Democrats, and that was plausible because there was a weariness with so many years of Democratic rule, the Americans might not have had a NATO or a permanent presence overseas. And so in that sense, I think Eisenhower made a difference. He also made a difference in another way, which is that he not only brought 8 years of peace, but he also avoided certain things that could have badly derailed the American presence. And most important, he refused to get involved in saving the French at Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, not because he was sympathetic to communism or didn't want to help the French, but because he said, if we get involved in Vietnam, it will swallow up our armies by the divisions. Very wise advice, which John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson failed to follow. But it did mean that the Americans stayed out of that land war in Asia. And the other thing he did was he refused the advice of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to use nuclear weapons against Vietnam and against China. And he said at one point, when they recommended to him, not just in Vietnam, but in the Quemoy Matsu crisis of the offshore islands off China's coast, he said, "You boys must be crazy to think we'd use those things on Asians against." He had a very strong moral streak against the idea of using the nuclear weapons, though he was quite happy to use them to bluff for his political purposes, but not to really use them. And if Eisenhower had not been president, you might not have had containment as a consolidated position of American foreign policy, and you might have had a president who would have used the nuclear weapons, and that would have led to a very different world, one that I think would have been much less stable. So you could argue that this third period of the three periods are America's entry into global politics with TR and Woodrow Wilson, and America's entry into World War II under Franklin Roosevelt, and then the consolidation of America's presence abroad under containment with Truman and Eisenhower. The fourth period of the consolidation of the growth of American power was under Reagan and the first, George Bush. And trying to be objective and understand the contribution of Ronald Reagan is difficult because very often people will say, well, Ronald Reagan won the Cold War when he said, "Mr. Gorbachev knocked down that wall." But in fact, the causation is much more complex than that. The truly transformational leader in the end of the Cold War, I would argue, was Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to save the Soviet Union, and he did that by basically instituting perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, or opening up. And the idea that Gorbachev had was this would save it, but it turned out that Gorbachev was like a fellow who has a sweater on, and the sweater has a loose thread. He starts to pull on the loose thread. Before you know it, he has no sweater. And so Gorbachev was truly transformational, but not in the direction that he intended. A little bit like Woodrow Wilson was, not in the direction he intended. And Reagan's great gift was to see that he could do a deal with Gorbachev. It wasn't the high defense budget and the rhetoric, though they contributed something. It was the fact that Reagan said, "I can do a deal with this guy." And he did. And he reached a series of deals with Gorbachev well ahead of where other members of his administration thought that was possible, which is kind of ironic because when people talk about a Reaganite foreign policy, they often say a Reaganite foreign policy is tough talk and a big defense budget. In fact, Reagan's skill as a politician was tough talk, a big defense budget, and a willingness to compromise. And that was a rare leadership capacity which not everybody had. So I think Reagan gets credit, but sometimes not the way people thought. If you do the counterfactual on this, and you say, well, suppose that somebody else had been president, the key question is who would have been president when Gorbachev came in. But if you take the counterfactual and you ask, imagine that Andropov, who was the Soviet Union leader after Brezhnev, had healthy kidneys. He died of kidney failure. Andropov was a tough KGB agent. I mean, he'd risen to the top of the KGB, tough as nails. And if he had stayed in power, I think you could make an argument the Soviet Union could have lasted another 10 or 15 years. Eventually it would have declined because it couldn't cope with what sometimes is called the Third Industrial Revolution, the information revolution, in which they didn't have the agility of a market economy to cope with it. But they could have persisted longer if you hadn't had this reformer, Gorbachev, pulling on the thread in the sweater. And Andropov probably kept them there, or could have kept them there for another decade or more. So if Reagan had faced Andropov, I doubt that we would have been crediting Reagan with contributing to the end of the Cold War. So the counterfactual testing on that one, I think, makes some difference. And that brings me to George H.W. Bush and the end of the Soviet Union, which really is when the American preeminence in world power becomes clear. without the Soviets as a balancing factor, then the Americans really are the world's only superpower. And George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, as he's sometimes called, was not a flashy leader. He was not somebody who came in with a goal of ending the Soviet Union. In fact, in his memoirs with Brent Scowcroft, he says just the opposite. But he had extraordinarily good judgment and extraordinarily good managerial experience. And if you think of what Bush did, he managed to see the end of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the reunification of Germany inside NATO without any fighting, without any bloodshed. Quite an extraordinary accomplishment. And it's interesting in that sense that when Bush 41 was asked this question at the end of the Berlin Wall in November of '89, why don't you make more of this? Why don't you make some big speeches that we've won the Cold War? We should be going out and really making a Reaganite type speech to show how well we've done. And Bush 41 said, no. He said, I'm not going to dance on the wall. Instead of that, he kept relatively quiet, and within the next month, he went to Malta for a summit with Gorbachev and began a process of negotiations which successfully unraveled the Soviet Union and ended the Cold War without violence. Really quite an extraordinary performance. So if Michael Dukakis, who was Bush's opponent in 1988, had been elected, would the outcome have been any different? Perhaps, because Dukakis, I think, would have wanted to negotiate with Gorbachev. Not sure he would have had the same experience in international affairs as the governor of Massachusetts that Bush had had with his preparation as running the CIA ambassador to China, then UN ambassador, and so forth. So then we have to ask ourselves the question, did leaders matter? I think what I've tried to demonstrate by looking at the alternatives is that, yes, some of them mattered. But then notice something, it's not always the ones that you would have expected who mattered most. Remember I said at the beginning that theorists tell you that transformational leaders are terrific and transactional or managerial leaders are not too important. But if you were listening closely to what I said, you'd notice that two of the heroes of my story were Dwight Eisenhower and George H.W. Bush. Neither of them transformational, neither of them flashy, both of them extremely skilled in managerial leadership. And I think when we look back at history and we ask what difference a leader made, you have to ask not only what did the leader decide that was a big issue, but what about the dogs that didn't bark? What about the things that the leader avoided? For example, if Eisenhower had used nuclear weapons, how would the world have looked? Or if George H.W. Bush had not been so skillful and nuclear weapons had been used at the end of the Cold War, how would the world look? So the fact that these two men who were transactional rather than transformational leaders played such a large role means that of the four key presidents in this story that I tell, who contributed positively to the growth of the American era, Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman were both transformational, and both of them somewhat more impressive on that scale. But Eisenhower and Bush 41 were both largely managerial or transactional. And so, yes, leaders matter, but we've got to be careful not to think it's flamboyance which makes a good leader. It may be contextual intelligence and judgment and knowing how to run things. Another way of putting this is, what are the lessons for American power in the 21st century of where we go from here? Should we be looking for a transformational or a transactional leader? Now, the best would be to have both. But compare Bush 41, who was, remember he always said, I don't do the vision thing, with Bush 43, who was keen to have a vision and, as he said, not to play small ball. I think you can make an argument that Bush 41 had one of the best foreign policies we've seen in the last half century or so, Bush 43, one of the poorest. And what's interesting is that you'll never find two men as president who are more similar in their genetic background than these two men. So it's not in your genes, but I think it does suggest that as we look for lessons for our century, we shouldn't be looking for flamboyance or great rhetoric. We should be looking for the ability to have contextual intelligence and managerial skills. Now, if you can combine that with good rhetoric, fine. But if you have to choose one or the other, I think we'd rather have the skill than that. The other thing is that we're dealing with a world in foreign affairs where you have to realize that in the diversity of cultures and amazing periods of revolutionary change, there's a lot to be said for the Hippocratic Oath, which, as you remember, is first of all, do no harm. So before you plunge into foreign affairs where you don't know for sure what the outcome is going to be, you want to remember that one of the basic principles of just war theory is that there should be a reasonable prospect of success before you enter into something. So in that sense, as we look ahead to the future of American power in this century, I think we want to be prudent, have great contextual intelligence about what's going on, and avoid these oversimplified metaphors like the United States is in decline or the United States is in control. The truth of the matter is I think the United States is going to be the largest and strongest country in the world for a good part of this century. I don't think the Chinese are about to pass us or be stronger than we are. I agree with the recent conclusion of a report by the National Intelligence Council of how the world will look in the year 2030, in which the National Intelligence Council, I may be a little bit biased since I once ran it, but the National Intelligence Council said the world in 2030 is likely not to reproduce the world of the 20th century with total American primacy, but is one in which the Americans are likely to be the leading country. That we're probably going to see a world in which we are primus inter pares, not the only country, but the most important country. But they also go on to say the crucial thing for the United States to realize in that world is that we can't do things alone. That if we're going to succeed, we're going to have to learn to work with others. And developing networks of countries that can work together on the problems we face is going to be the crucial aspect of maintaining American power. So I think the moral of this story, which I've told you tonight and which I spell out in more detail, I hope more convincingly in my next book, is that leaders matter, but how the leaders interact with their followers, the American people, and how they explain things, and how they make prudent judgments in a very complex, rapidly evolving world is going to be the secret of whether we're able to maintain American primacy well into this century. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, we would invite your questions, in particular from our students. Two things to remember. We'd ask you to queue up here on the west side at the rear of the room, and then we'd ask you to introduce yourself. Tell us your name, your major, and what you're studying. We have a few minutes for questions. Please begin to form a line.
Well, my name is Ryan Harrison. I'm an economics major. You speak about transactional leaders versus more leaders with a vision. How do you convince American voters in a democracy to choose a more managerial leader versus a transformational one that has very good rhetoric?
Well, it's a very interesting, important question, which is in a democracy, particularly in a democracy in the information age, there's likely to be an advantage to the person with the fancier rhetoric. But not always. Remember, Harry Truman, who was appointed initially but got reelected in 1948, was really a man with a transactional background. And it's also worth noticing that we often are surprised by what we get. In the 2000 election, foreign policy played almost no role. And George W. Bush, Bush 43, came into office without much interest in foreign affairs. And yet, after 9/11, he was transformed and then tried to transform the world by the invasion of Iraq. So he went through a major change. It would have been hard to have predicted that. It goes back even earlier. Woodrow Wilson in 1916 ran on the promise that he would keep us out of World War I. And by April 1917, he had us in World War I. So there's a problem for democratic theory of what happens when people are trying to judge whether the person they're voting for is going to produce the policies they prefer. And it's often very hard to judge that. I think what I'm suggesting is good rhetoric is good, but a good judgment is probably even more important. And how do you get the ability for voters to make that judgment about the candidate's good judgment? That's hard, and we sometimes get it wrong.
My name's Luke Miller. I'm a history major, and I'd just like to say thank you very much for coming today. I'm a big admirer of your work, and I was really excited to hear that you were coming. My question is about the mechanisms of cultural power. I was wondering, I define power as like our ability to get other nations to do things that they wouldn't normally do or wouldn't like to do. And so I'm wondering, how does our cultural power convince other nations or influence them to do things that they wouldn't normally do? And secondly, and perhaps more interestingly, is our cultural power something like an organic institution, or is it something that influences our government at least as much as it influences the policy of other states, or is it something that our government can effectively cultivate in order to further whatever ends our leaders deem desirable?
Well, it's interesting because I make this distinction between hard power. If power is the ability, as you say, to get others to do the things you want, you can do that three ways. You can do it through coercion and payment, which I call hard power, or you can do it through attraction and persuasion, which I call soft power. And culture is part of that soft power. Hard power is a lot easier to see and to demonstrate. You sail a carrier off the coast or you put economic sanctions on, it's very clear. But sometimes it may not be as effective for some instruments. For example, if you're trying to promote democracy in Eastern Europe during the Cold War, that was accomplished by that cultural power. I mean, when the Berlin Wall went down, it didn't go down under a barrage of artillery. It went down under hammers and bulldozers, which were wielded by people behind the Iron Curtain whose minds had been changed by ideas and culture. But that takes time, a long time. And so it's often, and it's also harder to see and harder to explain. So it's harder to get Congress to appropriate money for those purposes. The kinds of budgets that we have, if you look at what the government spends on public diplomacy, which can include everything from the Voice of America to Leaders Exchange to student exchanges, is probably about, a couple of hours of the Defense Department's budget. I mean, it's a mouse and an elephant, or maybe it's a flea and an elephant. We just don't spend a lot of money on it. And trying to persuade the American people that they should spend more on it, particularly at a time like this when we're cutting back on budgets, the first types of things that get cut are American libraries, American corners, hours of broadcasting, so forth. I think it's rather short-sighted, but but I do think that these long programs that take a long duration to have effect, that we associate with soft power, can often turn out to be extremely important. It's hard to show it in the short run. You can do it with historical case studies and show the demonstration of some of these facts of the past, but it's often very hard to sell it to a appropriations committee.
Troy Tessum, studying international relations, and again, thank you for coming. My question has a couple of different parts to it. You mentioned that in 2030, the United States would need to be able to work with other countries in order to get their agenda done. My question is, who are the countries that we need to maintain a critical alliance with? Who are the countries that we need to gain alliances with, stronger alliances with? And do you think that in order to do those things that it's more successful to use bilateral, multilateral avenues, or to work through the United Nations? And then what is one thing that President Obama should do today to begin that process for us to be prepared in 2030?
Well, I think it's all of the above, in the sense that there's no one organization or institution that's going to solve all problems. There's some things for which the UN can be effective. United Nations peacekeeping, for example, often is a way to prevent conflicts from getting out of control, very useful. But if you're trying to solve something like climate and you're trying to get a broad agreement, having 189 countries agree is at a conference is not very plausible. And we're going to need to use a variety of types of networks of countries. One thing we should notice is that we already stand in a good position by the alliances we have. Sometimes people say, oh, Europe doesn't matter anymore. Actually, Europe matters quite a lot. When Europe acts as an entity, its economy is bigger than the economy of the United States. What's more, for many of the problems that we're going to want to deal with relating to pandemics or monetary stability or other such issues, the Europeans have enormous capacity, and as do the Japanese, the third largest economy in the world. And so in that sense, the fact that we have close relations with Europe is something we should be maintaining, not letting erode. That goes also for our relationship, our alliance with Japan. But it's not just alliances in the traditional sense that we're going to need. If you look at, take international financial stability, if this can have enormous impacts, as we've seen, on the prosperity and well-being of the American people, if international financial stability is messed up. But now, increasingly, we're going to have China working with us in the international financial stability matters, which means that you're going to need something like not only the G7 and G8, which originated with the finance ministers of the rich countries, but you're now going to need to use the G20, which includes China, as well as India, Brazil, and others. So we're going to have to learn how to maintain our traditional alliances and networks, but supplement it with other networks for particular purposes on particular issues. And that defies the tendency of Americans to like a world in which they're good guys and bad guys. You know, they're white hats and black hats. And in fact, we're going to have to work sometimes with white hats and sometimes with black hats and often with a lot of gray hats. So I think the lesson for Obama, and I think on this he's actually been pretty good, he's going to have to work with China as well as work with our allies. He's going to have to work with India, Brazil. We're going to have to help develop networks. And one of the advantages the United States has is that given the openness of our society and the multitude of our contacts, we're probably better placed than almost any country to lead that network formation. Indeed, to pay tribute to what we were talking about at dinner here, what Brigham Young University students, when they do their missions and go overseas and learn other languages and become aware of the rest of the world, that's an important contribution. I wish we'd see more of it in other parts of the United States. So we're going to have to learn how to get out and use that skill of our openness to make multiple networks, not just say, here are the good guys, here are the bad guys, here's the institution, or that's the other institution. So it's going to take us to sort of grow up in how we see the world.
My name is Brandon Wilmore. I'm a political science major from Idaho. And my question is two parts. First of all, what do you think the relationship is between democracy and economic development? And second, what do you think the United States' role is in democracy promotion?
Well, there's a large literature, political science literature on democracy and economic development. And the simplified version is that there are two simplified versions. One is that democracy is good for economic development. The other is that it's bad for it. And both of those simplified versions are wrong. People who say, look how much more rapidly China has grown than India. China is an authoritarian system. India is a democracy. If India were just authoritarian, it would grow like China. Or if China were democratic, it would slow down like India. That's simplistic, because if you do a correlation of all democratic countries and rates of economic growth, it turns out that some of the authoritarian countries have the worst rates of economic growth. For every China that's got a high rate of economic growth is an authoritarian country, there's Zimbabwe that has an abysmal rate of economic growth. So that simple correlation of, that they're inversely related is wrong. I think there's an argument that is made the other direction, that democracy is necessary for economic growth, and that we know isn't true. We've seen rapid economic growth in countries that are not democratic. Not only China, but many of the countries in Southeast Asia have had rapid rates of economic growth without being democracies. I think probably the causal arrows work more in the direction that after a certain amount of economic growth, there tends to be a demand of a middle class that's produced by economic growth for more participation in the political system, which eventually becomes more democratic. So I think economic growth tends to foster democracy, but the argument that democracy is either a barrier or a necessary condition for economic growth, I'm not convinced by those arguments.
I'm Peter Xie. I'm a second-year MBA student. I'm here to represent China. I have two questions, actually. The first one is, what do you see the challenges that United States face when they deal with the relationship with China? And the second question is, I read your recent remarks about soft power, China's soft power. So with a new leadership with very little desire to develop democracy, so what can the new leadership learn from United States to become better leaders in the future?
Well, I think that the good news about the U.S.-China relationship is that while there's competition and difficulties, and you can point to all sorts of complaints on both sides all the time, neither country presents an existential threat to the other. Unlike Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Soviet Union, China doesn't present that kind of a threat to us, and vice versa. We're going to have a relationship with China which involves both cooperation and competition. And the problem is, that's the proverbial problem in American folklore of, can you learn to walk and chew gum at the same time? Can we learn to have a good relation with China which is both competitive and cooperative? I think we can, and I think it's interesting that over the past 20 or 30 years, we've pretty well done that. In other words, there are lots of problems in the U.S.-China relationship, But by and large, we've managed to keep the cooperation ahead of the conflict. Now, one of the interesting problems for China is going to be, can they maintain the legitimacy of their political system without using too much nationalism? So I think when you look at Xi Jinping, he has a problem, which is the legitimacy of the Communist Party rule in China has rested upon a high rate of economic growth and a certain amount of ethnic nationalism. If the economic growth rate diminishes somewhat, will he have to dial up the nationalism? And when you look at the disputes between China and its neighbors, you'll notice that nationalism does play a role, both in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. And I think that's the piece that would worry me, that is whether the new leadership in China, by increasing its use of nationalism, worsens its relations with its neighbors and also with the U.S. It need not happen. I think top Chinese leaders are aware of this. But if you look at China's foreign policy between 2008 and 2011, they worsened their relations with India, with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, with Vietnam. That's not a very good foreign policy record. And I would argue that the key to success for China will be go back to Deng Xiaoping's advice, which is bide your time, and what the Chinese did in the early part of the 2000s, which some people called a charm offensive, but was essentially to increase China's soft power or attractiveness to its neighbors. I hope that's the path that Xi Jinping will take, but we'll have to see.
My name is Nick Pericles. I'm a sophomore studying statistics, and I'm from Richmond, Virginia. And during the course of your discourse, you alluded to George Washington and how he said the United States should have no entangling relationships. I was wondering if you could expound a little more on what the Founding Fathers' vision was for foreign policy when they formed the United States, when they were meeting together and talking about it.
Well, it's an interesting period to look at because remember, the United States was small and weak. We had this big continent, but we hadn't filled it out. We were essentially an adjunct to the European balance of power. Remember, our independence had to do with the fact that France, because it was fighting Britain in Europe, came and helped us. And that final help at the Battle of Yorktown made all the difference. So in the sense, the European balance of power helped us. But George Washington and the Founding Fathers said, the last thing we want to do is get caught up in all of that. We don't want to. Washington has this wonderful phrase. In fact, I use it in the preface to my new book, saying, why would somebody so perfectly situated as we are behind these oceans want to get involved with the rest of the world? Good question. You know, and in sense, one of the puzzles of the 20th century is why did we leave that preferred position and get involved with the rest of the world? And I've tried in a very abbreviated form to spell out that story for you tonight. But, and American foreign policy, not just among the Founding Fathers, but for the first century was, we'll just stay in our hemisphere. You know, we'll keep the Monroe Doctrine says we'll keep the Europeans out of our hemisphere, but we'll just stay over here and not get involved in Europe. And I think what happened is as we got bigger and had more of an influence on the world, we discovered that we couldn't be that indifferent to what happened in more distant parts of the world. And whatever the truth that was in 1900 or 1918, it's certainly true today in the world in which missiles can cross the world in 30 minutes, and cyber attacks can cross the world in 300 milliseconds. So the argument that we have that luxury the Founding Fathers had, I think, is long gone. But it is interesting to compare their perception of the world and how we could sort of stay out of it with how we got increasingly involved in it during the 20th century.
Reed Simmons, studying accounting. You talked about how leadership was responsible for the growth of American power of the 20th century. And I guess my question is, do you feel that holds true or held true for the periods of decline during the 20th century in American power? Was leadership as responsible as it was for the growth?
I think so. I think the leadership of Woodrow Wilson produced the conditions that led to the reaction against America's involvement of the world. So I think that decline of American power from 1920 to 1940 had a lot to do with Wilson and of the leaders who followed him, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. So I think leadership was definitely important there. I'd also say that leadership was important to the second period where I think American power declined. I think the leaders who got us into the Vietnam War, particularly John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, and were basically hubristic and made mistakes which cost us dearly. And Nixon and Kissinger tried to, they saw the United States as declining at that period, and they thought their opening to China would help to arrest that decline, but it was a response to what they saw as decline. And Nixon's opening to China was a very good thing, but it wasn't enough to reverse the problems that had been occurring by our involvement in Vietnam. And by the other thing that Nixon did, which was a mistake, was to unleash rampant inflation by breaking the international monetary system in 1971, so that Ford, his successor, and Carter had to battle a situation where you had the reaction against the war, both at home and abroad, plus a weakening of the American economy through this so-called stagflation. So I'd argue that bad leadership in the period of the 60s and 70s contributed to a reversal of American growth and power. And so I would argue that the two periods of the century where we went in reverse had a lot to do with poor leadership. Well, thank you all very much.